I posted a few videos today. One video I created this week was for my kindergarten students, but I didn't want to leave out the adults and the older learners. I'd like to do just a quick, maybe 5-10 minute video about the white buffalo circles. When I work with kindergarten students, one of the first things I introduce is my bundle. But when I work with older students and adults, one of the first things I talk about is the term Indigenous. So in my role, I am an Indigenous support worker. There's been a lot of words that people have called my people over the years. Indian was something that I got a lot when I was younger. Native, First Nations, Aboriginal, Indigenous. There's all these different terms, and it's very confusing for most Canadians. You know, if I ask the average Canadian who is Indigenous in Canada, I bet a lot of Canadians wouldn't have the answer to that question. So I just want to do a quick video about about who is Indigenous in these lands. So first, let's talk about that word Indians. A lot of people think and thought that we were called Indians because when Christopher Columbus came to these lands, he was looking for India, and that's where Indians come from. But actually, that's not true, because in 1492, India wasn't even called India. India was called Hindustan. The word Indian, and same with the root in indigenous, comes from the Latin language indios. And indios in Latin talks about people of the land, people of God. So Indian really has nothing to do with the country of India. It's just a Latin root. So we usually don't like to call ourselves Indians. I know a lot of people still use that term, especially in the world circles that I travel in. But it's just a little bit confusing because people from India are Indians. People from Canada are Canadians, you know. So somebody said to me, "Joel, are you an Indian?" I would say, "Yes, I'm an Indian," but I would understand their level of education. If someone said to me, "Are you native?" That's a little bit better, I think, than Indian. If they said to you, "Joel, are you First Nation?" All right, now this person's starting off their game a little bit. If somebody said to me, "Joel, are you Anishinaabe?" then I would be a little bit impressed, because Anishinaabe is what the Ojibwe people call ourselves. That's the word in our language for ourselves. So there's all sorts of terms around Native people. Now, Native people, First Nations, we're the oldest group of Indigenous peoples here. If you ask our elders, they'll tell you that God put us here in these lands at the time immemorial, which means the beginning of time. They used to teach us in school that First Nations people came across the land bridge during the last ice age. Problem with that theory is, well, it's been disproven. That last ice age started about 14,000 years ago and ended about 12,000 years ago. And we have recent carbon dated archaeological evidence that predates the last ice age. We have evidence of 15,000-year-old settlements here in North America. So First Nations people, we are indigenous to these lands. And when you say that term First Nations, you are talking about hundreds of nations. At the time of contact in 1492, there was over 500 nations living here in Turtle Island, and estimates upwards of 100 million people. So indigenous people include the First Nations. When you say that word Aboriginal, it's pretty much the same word as indigenous. We've just kind of moved away from that word Aboriginal because the United Nations, when they talk about peoples of the land, they use the term indigenous. So we want to kind of unify the term for peoples of that land, and the term that we use today is indigenous. However, First Nations are not the only group of indigenous people. There's 3 groups that the Canadian government considers to be indigenous to these lands. So the First Nations, we are one. The Inuit are another. So in the northern part of Turtle Island up there in the Arctic, the Inuit migrated here about 6,000 years ago, and they've been up there ever since. None of it, when I was young, wasn't even a place. It didn't exist. It was all the Northwest Territories when I was in grade school. So the Inuit, they are indigenous as well, having lived here in Turtle Island for the past 6,000 years. And the third group of people are the Métis Nation. And there's a lot of confusion around the Métis people in the mainstream population of Canada, because the word Métis in French, small m, Métis, just means mixed ancestry, mixed blood. So I would venture that most Canadians have some form of mixed blood, right? Unless your grandparents on your mother's side and your father's side are all 100% something, you have some sort of mixed ancestry in your DNA. But that's obviously not who's Indigenous, because then we'd all be considered Indigenous. When the Europeans first started to come to Turtle Island, one of the major industries was the fur trade. The fur trade was a $1 billion industry by today's standards. And there was a couple powerhouse companies back then, like the Hudson Bay Trading Company and the Northwest Trading Company. Now, mostly the men that worked for these companies were of French and later Irish and Scottish descent, different European ancestry, but mostly French in the beginning, I would say. And these guys traveled through the rivers and lakes of Turtle Island looking for First Nations communities to trade for fur. Now, over hundreds of years of this relationship between the First Nations and those Métis fur traders, the Métis Nation was born. Now, it's a little confusing. I'm going to try to get through it here as quick as I can, but you can't just all of a sudden become a nation. You can't just get, a couple thousand people together and say, we are a nation, and expect to be recognized in the global scene. The United Nations sets out these criteria of what a nation is. So you got to have a land base. You got to have a language. You got to have socioeconomic development. You got to have your own unique culture, and you got to have a governing system. So what happened was, over 300 years of connecting First Nations people and French men, so they were French men who would marry First Nations women, this unique culture was born here on Turtle Island in the last 300 or 400 years, the Métis Nation. The children of these relations, their father was a French man, their mother was a First Nations woman. And again, over hundreds of years, they developed their own unique language, which is Michif. Michif is kind of this hybrid language between First Nation language and French language, but it's unique to Turtle Island. They have their own governing system, right? Gabriel Dumont, Louis Riel are some of Canada's founding fathers of government. So they have their own governing system for sure. They have their unique culture, language. They have land bases all across this country. The Métis Nation is who is considered to be Indigenous to these lands because it's a culture that was born here in Canada on the rivers and lakes during the fur trade era. And sometimes it's actually easier to prove you're Métis because those trading companies kept fantastic records of their employees. Whereas in the residential schools for First Nations people, a lot of times our names were changed and maybe we were given numbers, or the documentation and the records were terrible in those places. So if you can trace your ancestry back to one of these fur trading companies, there's a good chance if through the Métis Nation of Ontario that you can find out if you have Métis Nation, capital M, Métis Nation ancestry. So yeah, when I teach adults, that's kind of the first thing I like to talk about is who is Indigenous in these lands. So First Nations people, Ojibwe, we are one of those many First Nations. The Inuit, people in the Arctic parts of Turtle Island, and the Métis Nation. Those are the Indigenous peoples in these lands. All right, so there's a quick lesson on Indigenous people in Canada. Hope you enjoyed that little clip of white buffalo circles. So everybody, you take care, be safe out there, and I'll see you again soon.